You don't need to be an expert to create a game in Dreams. You don't need to know much of anything. If you've got a bit of an imagination and you've ever used a search engine, you can make a game in Dreams. And in our Project Fool video series, we show you how.
This is our final video on our short horror game, Out of Gas, made in just 5 weeks. In today's video, we'll be giving an overview of how you can very easily make a simple horror game in Dreams. The first thing we need to stress, we could not have made this game when Dreams first launched. Dreams first became available to everyone in early access in 2019, and back then, if you were interested in making a game, you pretty much had to figure everything out for yourself. Fast forward 2 years and that's no longer the case. Dreams gives you the power to make whatever you want from scratch, but the true secret source of the engine is how any creation made in Dreams, made shareable by the community, can be easily and immediately imported into your own game. Assets, logic, characters, even entire maps. Now, in the 2 years since Dreams first launched, its community has done an amazing job of making this pool of resources incredibly useful, and in order for us to make this game in only 5 weeks, we abused the heck out of this feature. In fact, almost every single asset from Out of Gas is from community creations, and that includes the main playable character, everything in the environment, even the lighting. There are limitations, you may even have to make some compromises, but for the most part, this drag, drop and play approach to creation is easy, intuitive and incredibly satisfying. Essentially, Media Molecule has taken the complicated workflows of gameplay development and offered a tactile alternative that is more akin to playing Lego. We've already shared how we use this design philosophy to create the environment for Out of Gas, but today we'll be showing you exactly how we turned an empty map into a short horror game which managed to dominate the most popular Dreams in October, became a Media Molecule pick and even got featured in their blog, and how we did it with not only no previous game development experience, but truth be told, with very little knowledge of the Dreams tools. And if we can do it, so can you.
Out of Gas is made up of 5 separate scenes: a title splash, the opening where we set the story, the main game itself, an ending cutscene, and a credit scene. Think of scenes as levels, and in the Dreams creation screen you can see here, you can link them together to make a game. The title splash screen is a remixable template made by creator Doncare, whose name is going to come up a lot in this video. They are the creator of an early and incredibly underrated horror game made in Dreams called NOTC, where you explore a creepy cabin in the woods. Our game, Out of Gas, was very much inspired by NOTC, and we borrowed many elements from it in our own development. Here's a comparison between NOTC's title screen on the left and Out of Gas on the right. The logic used to make this very short opening is quite considerable, and truth be told, we don't understand a lot of what's going on under the hood here. Instead of having to make something like this from scratch, we made a few changes to the scenery and adjusted the doorways and text boxes already programmed for our own uses, and so very quickly we had a very polished opening, not to mention an eye-catching thumbnail.
We wanted to make a narrative game, and in turn wanted our opening to set the scene and introduce you to the 2 main characters. We just had one problem with that. Animating a cutscene with character models is very time consuming, and it takes a great deal of skill to have a finished scene that looks good. So we decided to try something much easier, but a lot riskier. Instead of a cutscene, our game opens up with a black screen, with some dramatic text overlays popping up on the screen. Very easy to do, with a timeline and a simple text gadget. From here we have a cutscene without a cutscene. The camera remains on its static black screen, and instead of animations, all the player experiences is audio. So how much longer until we get to the cabin?
We've still got a little ways more to go yet. It's gonna blow your mind. The view is so gorgeous.
Have you ever taken girls up there before?
Oh yeah, girls love it up there. Ow! Hey!
You'd better be joking, mister. The full scene goes on for about 60 seconds. Much longer than we'd have liked it, because 60 seconds is a very long time to be looking at a black screen. At best, players might think it's cinematic. At worst, it's boring as heck and quit the game. To counter this, we tried to make the scene as detailed as possible. It's not just two people talking, instead it's layered with the sound of them driving down the road, the radio, even little things like the brakes being used and the jingle of keys.
Now we enter the main game proper and we see the first of Out of Gas's horror mechanics. Mechanics is most likely too strong a word. A text box and a loud sound effect paired together create a very effective, albeit cheap, jump scare.
Jesus! God! Every time! Every time!
We'd recently watched Zombieland for the first time, and if you haven't seen it, the film has a very clever way of displaying text in the physical scenes. We were inspired to use this throughout the game to make some scares that were cheap as chips. Despite our own fear of any proper sort of animation, we wanted to at least attempt a cinematic looking transitional effect as you take control of the character for the first time. This was done using an overhead camera which quickly transitions to the first person puppet, and a car door sound, again with no animation, is a fun cheat we used. The puppet we're using is another thing borrowed from Donkier. It's an element they shared called PT style first person horror puppet. It has a more natural gait than the default first person puppet, and a built-in head bob as you walk, which helps add to the atmosphere. The puppet also comes with a run feature attached to the L1 button, but we didn't want to give the player this option immediately, as we wanted the first few moments of player control to be a slow walk up the road to start building some tension. Which means, as much as we try to avoid it, we had to play with some simple logic.
Luckily, the existing logic setup by the puppet's creator made this very simple. All we did was add a switch gadget you can turn off and on, and set the running to off when the game starts. As you walk up the road, observant players should spot a pair of glowing eyes in the distance. If we turn on the lights and head over to this usually inaccessible part of the woods, you'll get a good look at who these creepy peepers belong to. This is another puppet we found in Community Creations, just with a slight modification to its eyes to add a glow effect. As the player first begins the game, the wolf will be looking in their direction, but there are triggers set across the road for the wolf to turn its gaze towards the player, and eventually disappear altogether when the player's vision of it is blocked by a tree branch. Creepy stuff. In fact, we've talked before about how the wolf is one big red herring. Its glowing eyes on the right meant to grab your attention and distract you from the dark figure on the other side of the forest. But more on that in a bit.
Walking further up the road, you'll hit another trigger zone, which activates a loud screaming sound.
Foxes. It's just foxes.
To the surprise of many gamers, yes, this is kind of what a fox sounds like. There are actually no sound recordings of foxes in Dreams, so we edited the pitch of a woman's scream to get it as close as possible. We made a conscious decision to have the playable character react to things going on in the environment. This is often frowned upon in horror games, as if the main character is reacting, the player might not be. In the end, we tried to find a balance between the two, letting some moments speak for themselves. As we approach the gas station, another trigger zone causes the lights to stop buzzing on and off. Very simply done with a keyframe and a timeline. Another jump scare triggers a very simple cutscene made with audio and camera transitions as you hear the car mysteriously driving away. Off screen, the game is removing the car and opening a new pathway for the character, as well as activating some more creepy triggers. As you walk past the gas station, the lights will now explode. This was done with a pre-made explosion effect we duplicated several times and paired with a glass shattering sound effect. Get to the top of the road and another cutscene plays and a text prompt comes up informing the player they can now hold L1 to run. This is all to guide the player back to the start of the level. Another blink and you miss it moment, when the player is running back to the car, a wolf will quickly run across the screen. We used the same wolf puppet as before and tried our hand at using the possession animation gadget, which lets you control the puppets like a normal playable character and record the actions you do. Originally the wolf jumped over the barrier, but the pre-made jump animation did not look very good. Instead, we edited the wolf's properties and made it so it no longer collided with the barrier. In the final game, it runs straight through the barrier, which looked a lot smoother as a horror scare, and the darkness helps cover the potential jankiness of the wolf clipping through an object. Hey, controlling wild animals can be hard.
When the player gets to the end of the road, they should hopefully notice that both the car and the barrier behind it is gone, and there are tyre tracks leading into the now enterable forest. We had concerns this wouldn't be obvious, so we put a massive and not so subtle light to try and grab the player's attention. When you move into the forest, another trigger will cause a tree to fall and block the entrance. This was achieved with keyframes. We recorded the initial position of the tree and then recorded it where it needed to fall and smoothed these two positions together. Initially, this tree asset was one whole piece, but it was turned into two by duplicating it and deleting half to allow a stump to stay in place when it fell. It's not only another scare, but it acts to contain the player in this new area. So if they get stuck, they don't end up heading back to the road and the gas station, where there is no more progress to be made. This is a good point to talk about the invisible walls dotted around the area. As you first enter the forest, it appears to be a very open area, but we try to lead the player where they need to go with lighting and dirt tracks. As we developed the next half of the game, we had concerns player would wander deeper into the forest too soon and there would be some potential sequence breaking. We made the decision to wall this area in until the player finds the now hidden car. But this is the only instance of this. The only other invisible walls we used were to shore up the barriers on the opening road to stop players from clipping into the forest early.
Inside the small shack, the player will find the car locked and an ominous message from the killer. In the opportunities we've had to watch people play Out of Gas, most people actually miss this message. For most types of games, if people are missing content you've laid out like this, you might have a problem. For a horror game, we don't think it's much of a big deal. For players that do manage to find this without us holding their hand, the overall effect may be much greater. There's a much more creepy example as players walk further into the forest. There is a sinister detail we've not yet seen any players discover by themselves as of yet. Unbeknown to the player, there is another person in the forest watching you. In fact, they've been watching you all along. Back at the start of the game, when seemingly observant players may have had their eyes trained on the glowing red eyes of the wolf on the right, in fact this would have left their backs exposed to the true threat of the game, who is watching you from the woods even at this early stage. As the player walks deeper into the forest, a trigger is hit which causes the strange figure to quickly walk deeper into the forest. It is even possible, if you approach from the right angle and head directly towards them, to come within inches of the stalker, but he will quickly disappear. This deep into the map, the player finds an abandoned church graveyard hidden behind a locked gate and a simple puzzle on the right. We have mixed feelings when it comes to puzzles in horror games. Generally, we're not fans, as it has a tendency to slow down the pacing too much, especially if the player gets stuck. For this reason, we made it super easy, a game of warmer and colder, which leads you to the cemetery key. The gate was another thing we cut corners with. With the key in hand, you're now meant to open the gate. Sounds simple, but there's a lot of pieces to the gate, including the lock and chain. We didn't have time to work out how to properly animate it opening, so instead we used a text box background and another handy keyframe / timeline combo to fade the screen to black. Activate a second version of the lock and chain on the floor and reposition the gate to the open position. Does it look a little out of place? Definitely, but we had a deadline to hit.
Let's crap out this piece of crap.
At the far end of the graveyard, you trigger another simple cutscene where the main character discovers, spoilers, her boyfriend was behind this whole thing all along. Here, we trigger the fog distance to close in on the player and start to play creepy, horror, atmosphere music, which we were so patient not to use until this point. We're heading to the game's climax now, and we want things at their creepiest. The game makes it clear your goal is to simply make it back to the car, but we've hidden a load of sound triggers between here and there, which include running footsteps and heavy breathing in your ear, letting the player's imagination do the rest of the work. As the player enters the shack, a trigger turns the music off. Possibly this makes the player feel safer, or maybe it feels like a pregnant pause as they reach for the car handle and...
Oh wait, before we get to the end. Using the Project Fool methodology, we wanted to make a game using only community assets and logic, but we found this isn't always possible. There are two small instances where, other than the magic keyframe and timeline combo we abused the heck out of, we had to use some real honest-to-God logic we designed ourselves. With the truck, before the player has met the ending requirements, we need to allow the player to jiggle the door handle without actually triggering the ending. We recorded a quick animation of the handle moving using keyframes that have been blended together. These record the outcome of an action. Each keyframe has the handle in a different position, so the animation can be sped up or slowed down by dragging the position of these on the timeline. The animation is triggered by the player pressing a specific button whilst in the correct place. This is registered by the controller sensor and the puppet being in the trigger zone. We wanted this to be triggered as many times as the player would like before they retrieve the keys to open the truck. Once the player has retrieved the keys, the cutscene begins when they try to open the car. So for all this to happen, bear with me here. The logic needs to register that the key has been collected, so the player needs to be pressing the button in the trigger zone and the key needs to be present. Now we don't have a physical key or an inventory system, so the key in this instance is in the form of a switch, which is triggered by a keyframe. Once the player has collected the key, the switch is triggered, so the outcome of the logic is changed. The exact same principle was used earlier to enable the gate to the graveyard to be opened once the player has retrieved the key from the mouth of the tree. Anyway, where were we?
The player reaches for the car handle and...
Found you!
You get got. Again, this was done with a simple cutscene made from cameras on a timeline. A keyframe turns on the boyfriend's puppet, which has been there all along, with his arms stretched out. We turn on a camera shake gadget, throw in some creepy laughs, and we're good to go. The boyfriend is the same puppet we used for the person watching you from the woods earlier, which again we found in Community Creations, but through a creepy mask we found on him to make him a little more frightening. This brings us to the ending cutscene, a dark ending where the main character gets buried alive. Here we have a time-lapse of the whole creation process made with our old friend, the keyframe timeline combo, and a little dash of paint. While this is playing, we have a few final thoughts to share. Regarding the lighting, this was done with a combination of the Sun and Sky gadget and the Grades and Effects gadget. Everything is set quite dark, with the colours set to a pale blue. We've had a lot of people saying they thought parts of the game were too dark, which was very surprising to us. We're big believers that going too dark is definitely a bad thing for horror, and we were very conscious of that when designing the game. We're almost always driving the player up the map, which is where the moonlight is coming from, so as long as you're going in the right direction, you shouldn't have too much trouble. But we realised this could be frustrating for the player. At the same time, we playtested Out of Gas and realised the level of lighting was vastly different on two different TVs, which, dodoy, is why games have a brightness adjustment setting and is definitely something we'll be looking to add in the next game we make. One especially sneaky thing we do in the middle of the game is just straight up sort of lie to the player. Not long after we give the player the ability to run, a hint will pop up on the screen as the player enters the forest, informing them that while running is faster than walking, it also makes more noise. While this is a factual statement, it has no bearing on the gameplay whatsoever. It doesn't matter if you slowly stalk around the map or blast through it like you're the Flash, there are no systems in place to react to this. But that simple piece of text appearing on the screen had a noticeable effect on every player we saw play the game. Unethical? Maybe, but definitely effective.
All the voice acting was done by us using Media Molecule's audio importer. We were able to use a Blue Yeti microphone to record the dialogue on the PC audio editing program Audacity, and then apply effects such as noise reduction for a better sound and import these into the game. We found it easier to organise by importing one clip at a time rather than the bulk upload. But it's worth noting this was made easier with there being two of us, because one was doing the importing on the PC while the other organised the files in Dreams. Another thing made easier by having two pairs of hands was getting subtitles into the game. One person types them out using InDream's web browser, while the other organised the subtitle gadgets and lined them up with the audio files in-game. The final scene of the game is the credits, which is a simple remixable scene we found, with a fantastic song that was shared by creator Reddish Boat. And that takes us to the end of our development of Out of Gas. Made in 5 short weeks, it was our first effort at making a game together and putting the project full design methodology to a test. We kept complicated logic to a minimum. Other than the 2 examples outlined in the video, everything in Out of Gas was made from either community assets and logic or simple combinations of gadgets such as keyframes and timelines.
If you want to take a closer look at the guts of Out of Gas, or if you'd like to use the map as a starting point for your own horror game, as of this video, it is now remixable in Dreams for your use. Just search for Ugly Sofa Gaming on Dream Shaping to find our Out of Gas collection.
There's no cabin, I'm afraid, but that is a beautiful view, is it not?
Please don't do this.
Shh. Don't spoil the moment. You're okay? You're gonna be fine? I'll take good care of you. I take good care of all my girlfriends.